Do la parola a David James. Grazie, David.
Right, good morning. Is everybody wearing their headsets? Some of you don't need headsets. This is going to be simultaneous translation. If you don't have a headset. Right. Is everybody switched on? Yep, it's working. Right, good morning. My colleague and I are forensic psychiatrists from the United Kingdom, but we work in a police unit. This is an unusual arrangement. The police unit has national responsibility for preventing stalking of prominent persons, mainly members of Parliament and members of the royal family. My colleague is going to give you an interesting presentation with pictures and stories and videos. But first, I'm going to give you a more serious presentation with no videos, very few pictures, and I'm going to explain the way we approach the assessment of risk in stalking in our police unit. Now, the elements of assessment and management in stalking can be split into four approximate stages. We heard in the last talk about screening, checklists, how to select out the cases that are most worrying and most dangerous. Then there is detailed assessment for the most serious cases. There is no point in assessing risk unless this also incorporates a way of reducing risk. And I shall be talking about that. And lastly, I shall talk about the treatment of stalking. Why is treatment important? Why is it important in our police unit? It is because treating stalkers stops recidivism. So I've outlined in red the two topics that I shall be dealing with this morning. Why do we need a detailed assessment of stalking cases? Well, firstly, in order to protect the victim, also to determine the intensity of the police and the legal response. We have limited resources, so we wish to employ them with high-risk cases and not with low-risk cases. The assessment helps formulate the management plan, and it indicates the treatment needs of the stalker. Now, there are two fundamental principles in assessing risk in stalking. Firstly, what is the nature of the risk? And the second thing is the importance of motivation. And I shall go through these two now. The first issue, risk of what? Well, victims and courts want to know three things when they're being stalked. First of all, will the person be violent? Secondly, will they continue with this form of behavior indefinitely? And thirdly, if they stop, are they going to start again? When we talk about risk, we are not talking about one thing, because risk is not a unitary construct. There are different types of risk in stalking, and this is important because different risk types have different risk factors. Okay. So the first risk field is evidently that of violence. In other words, the likelihood that the stalker will cause physical harm to somebody else. But then we have the field of persistence, And this means that the stalker will continue stalking the victim and perhaps other people too, unless an intervention is undertaken. That is a different form of risk, and it has different risk factors associated with it. The risk factors for violence are not the same as the risk factors for persistence, and vice versa. Then we have the risk of recurrence. This means that when the stalker stops the behavior, they will start again, either with the same victim or a different victim. We then have the risk of psychosocial damage. By this, we mean the likelihood of the stalker suffering loss of family, loss of job, loss of home, because when somebody loses everything, they have nothing left to lose, and they are therefore more dangerous and more likely to behave in violent and difficult ways. In looking at stalkers of public figures, we consider two other forms of risk. First of all, escalation. This is the likelihood of the behavior progressing to something more difficult or dangerous. In other words, somebody who writes threatening letters, progressing to turning up, pursuing in person the victim. And we also have the risk of disruption. By disruption, I mean causing distress and embarrassment to public figures and stopping them going about their normal duties in the normal way. So, just to summarize that again, we have stalking and we have the risks of violence, persistence, recurrence, psychosocial damage to the stalker, and in public figure cases, escalation and disruption. Now, why do we split risk into types? I repeat, this is because different domains of risk are associated with different risk factors. Somebody can be high risk in one domain, but low risk in another domain. So somebody could have a high risk of persistence, but a low risk of violence. Or the other way around, a high risk of violence, but a low risk of persistence. It's necessary to assess these areas separately. What is stalking? Well, stalking is a convenient term for a set of behaviors, but it is not one homogeneous entity, and it can result from a number of very different motivations. And it is important in stalking cases to elicit the motivation in order to be able accurately to assess the risk. This is because different motivations carry different risks. Sorry, I'm losing my slide, please. Okay, these are just articles in English illustrating that motives are very different. But I shall go through the motivations one by one. The classification of motives, which is now generally accepted, was written by the Australians in the 1990s. And there are 5 different groups of motivation, each of which has different risks associated with them. The first are people that are trying to establish intimate relationships, usually with somebody of the opposite sex. Some people are psychotic and believe that a relationship exists when it does not. Other people simply believe that it is fate that they have a relationship. This is an English case recently in which a TV producer stalked a woman, followed her around, followed her children, and so on, Googled her 40,000 times. He was eventually taken to court and sentenced. But he was trying to establish a relationship with this woman who he idealized. The second category is that of an inadequate stalker, somebody that is pursuing a relationship with somebody else, but not in order for intimacy, simply for a sexual encounter, but the person has no social skills and is unable to understand social cues, and so becomes persistent and stalks. But the difference is that they do not believe that they wish to have an intimate relationship, they simply want to have a sexual relationship. We have rejected stalkers. These are ex-partners who are trying to re-establish a relationship with their former partner. And these are the cases in which there is most likely to be serious violence. These are pictures of 3 young women, all of whom were killed by their ex-partners in Britain, quite high-profile cases. The first time I showed this slide at a talk at a police conference, the mothers of 2 of these girls were in the audience, and I did not know. And these are English newspaper headlines about part of our research, simply showing that the most dangerous stalkers in terms of serious violence are ex-partners, the rejected. The next group are resentful people. These are people who are engaging in a vendetta against somebody else because they have a grievance. They have some reason to feel that they have been wronged or slighted. These cases can be extremely difficult. This case, Britain's worst stalker, is one that I was involved with. The parents of this man asked a doctor and a social worker to assess his mental health needs. He objected to this, and he started stalking the hospital organisation and solicitors, and pursued 200 people over 7 years. He attacked several of them. He burnt a car. He burnt down the house of one person. They were lucky to escape across the roof. He had a torture chamber constructed in his flat. He collected bottles of acid. All his life was focused on revenge. And evidently, somebody who is focused on revenge is not the same as somebody who is seeking love. So it's not surprising that the risk factors associated with different motivations should not be the same. And lastly, there are predators. These are people that are stalking as a prelude to a physical or a sexual attack. One occasionally comes across these. This is an example of somebody that was stalking the film director Spielberg with the aim of raping him. So, it's important to establish what type of stalker one is dealing with in order to be able to assess the risk. Now, I'm going to tell you next about a manualized risk assessment tool that we use in our unit and which is beginning to be used more widely in specialist centres for assessing stalking. It is useful to police, it is useful to lawyers to use in court, but it is something that is an assessment conducted by psychologists or doctors or specially trained probation or correctional officers, and is therefore quite complicated. It comes in the form of a book, and I'm going to explain to you how this came about and how it is structured in order to give you an idea of our approach to threat assessment. This is just a photograph of the authors at the launch of the book in Melbourne, in Australia. It incorporates the two main ideas that I told you about so far, looking at different sorts of risk and looking at risk factors for each different sort of risk. And it also incorporates differences in motivation. Now, why do we need to use something like this when we are assessing stalkers? Why does there need to be a specialist way of assessing things? Well, it is useful to have an assessment method that is structured. In other words, you can go through it the same way with everybody that you see. It's standardized. It acts as an aide-memoire. In other words, it stops you forgetting to ask certain questions. It assures that your practice is based upon the best evidence that there is and is up to date. It points to ways in which you can manage the risk, in other words, reduce the risk, and it allows you to review the outcome of your intervention and to see how risk changes over time, whether your policing intervention works, whether your legal intervention works. You can reassess the level of risk to judge your effectiveness. And it leads to defensible practice. Now, there are a lot of instruments that are used by psychologists and by psychiatrists and in prisons to assess the likelihood of violence or the likelihood of reoffending. But these do not work well with stalkers. You can use some of these standardized tools and they will find stalkers that are evidently high risk are defined as low risk. Using standardized tools. Because they don't work, you need something that is special to stalking. The thing that I'm going to describe to you is based upon research in Australia, research elsewhere, research with victims of stalking, and 15 years of experience in a specialized clinic that deals with stalkers and victims. And much of the research that it is based upon is summarized in the standard textbook on stalking, which is, I think, available only in English and Japanese at the moment and not in Italian. But this is the best book on stalking for all disciplines, whether you're clinicians, policemen, lawyers. It is the encyclopedia of stalking. Now, I'm having to look at the slides in Italian, and that is why I'm having to translate them to myself, and so I'm a bit slow with changing them. How is this manual structured? How do we go about assessing risk using this? Well, the book has a background and introduction. It's got preliminary information on its use. It has a section on how to work out the motivation of the stalker that you are assessing. And then it has separate sections to assess violence, persistence, recurrence, and psychosocial damage. And it also separates it out into motivation. And then it has other things added on at the end to do with public figures. Now, it conceives risk of being constructed in three ways. Sometimes when you have risk assessment instruments, if you reply yes to 7 or 8 out of 10, then it seems very high risk. But there are some factors that even if only one of them is present, it makes the case high risk. So this particular manual incorporates ways of not only looking at the number of risk factors that are present, but which risk factor is more important than another. So, in this approach to risk, we first of all determine the type of stalker. We then go through the different risk factors and different domains, and we make risk judgments separately for each domain. And we work out intervention strategies in order to reduce the risks which we've described. Is that clear? Does everyone understand that? Okay. So we first of all determine who the victim is. That might sound strange, but in some situations where there are several victims, you have to determine which is the first victim in order to find out which is the relevant motivation. So we determine the stalker type, and we then select the appropriate part of the book to use. Now, I shall go through this quite quickly down to the next slides. The risk factors are coded as present, partially present, or absent. I'll show you simply one risk factor to show you what the book looks like inside. This is suicidal ideation. There is a description of what this means, followed by a description of what is needed in order to give a yes rating, a question mark rating, or a no rating. For each domain, it is then necessary to make the risk judgment. This is an example of one of the forms, and these are simply a list of risk factors relating to recurrence, for instance. And we then make a judgment in terms of the level of risk. So it could be low. This has practical implications in it, that it means that you don't actually need to do very much. There's a limited need for intervening with resources. If it is of moderate risk, this means that some sort of following of the case and management is necessary. And if it's high risk, this means that immediate intervention is necessary. And the idea is that you are only going to intervene where the risk is assessed as medium or high, and not in every case, and that is a good way of focusing your use of resources. The last thing I'm going to talk about is treatment. Now, this might seem to be not of immediate relevance to disciplines other than medicine, but it is. You need to treat stalking cases because if you do not, then the behavior will continue or it will recur. And this is analogous to sex offending. In the United Kingdom, if you're convicted of a sex offense, treatment is mandatory, usually in prison, and then after being released into the community. And the reason for that is that the likelihood of recidivism is high unless such treatment is instituted. And it is the same with stalkers. How do we get people into treatment? Well, it's usually on a compulsory basis, either as a condition of bail, a condition of a community sentence, a condition of parole after a prison sentence. And in some jurisdictions, you have mental health compulsory treatment, and this is also a framework in which stalking treatment can be initiated. Now, what do we mean by treatment? Well, evidently, if somebody is mentally ill, you're going to treat the illness. But what I'm really talking about here is treating the behavior. When you treat sex offenders, you're not treating an illness, you are treating a behavior. And it's the same in stalking. And we call this the problem behaviors model, and it is applied to people that engage in certain sets of behaviors, such as stalkers, threateners, sex offenders, arsonists. What does treatment actually involve? Well, the last little bit of my talk, I'm going to give you a little bit of detail about treatment because I think it's important to understand what one means by this, particularly if one was going to advocate treatment for stalkers in the future. Well, it involves psychological therapies. It involves treatment programs which are tailored to the individual stalker's own needs. And it is constructed through detailed assessment of the stalker using the approach that I have outlined to you. And it's looking at the personal strengths and weaknesses of the individual, their personality, their cognitive style, and of course their underlying motivation. The components of treatment, education. Sometimes simply educating somebody that their behavior constitutes stalking and is against the law is enough to make the behavior desist. But often it's very difficult to make any contact with stalkers, and the way that this is done is by doing a cost-benefit analysis. In other words, you say to the stalker, yes, you believe that what you're doing is right. Yes, you don't see it as a problem. Yes, you don't want to stop. But look for a minute. What's happened to you through this behavior? You've lost your job. You've been arrested. You now have a criminal record. You have police after you, etc., etc. So you try and get somebody to recognize that they have a problem by doing this. People rationalize and try and justify their stalking behaviors. It is necessary to isolate out each of these different forms of rationalization and justification and confront them. There is empathy training. Some people don't understand the effects they have on their victim. Some people understand very well the effect they have on their victim, and that's why they're stalking. But that is an area to concentrate upon. And then there is tackling skills deficits. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, skills deficits lead to people adopting maladaptive ways of pursuing goals and desires. So some people have poor verbal skills, are not able to express themselves in words, and so engage in behaviors like pestering people, following people. Sometimes it's as simple as they're being unable to put things into words. Some people have poor social skills. They simply don't know how to invite somebody out for a date, and so they engage in behavior which constitutes stalking. People have problems with low self-esteem or inflated self-esteem, and this affects the way that they deal with others and the idea they have that they have a right to a part in somebody else's life. Some people are just not very intelligent, and that's important to note in a stalker because it's going to affect your intervention method. Somebody that is not very intelligent has to be dealt with in a different way from somebody that is of normal intelligence. Some people have cognitive rigidity. In other words, they find it difficult to change ideas and change stance. And some people are just very poor at solving problems. Others may have problems with emotional regulation, too much anger, for instance. Now, in order to put this into practice, and these are my last few slides, we use the stages of change model. Now, this is perhaps familiar to anybody that is familiar with the treatment of alcoholics, for instance. The first stage is known as pre-contemplation. And this is where the person has no intention to change their behavior at all. They don't see the behavior as a problem. Many stalkers are like this at the beginning. And the treatment strategies are some that I've referred to already. Pointing out the law, discussing the effect on the victim, discussing the stalker's aims with the actual outcome, and showing the contrast. The second of the 5 stages is the phase of contemplation. This means bringing the person to see the behavior as a problem and bringing them to a decision that they actually want change, would like to do something about the problem. And this is where the cost-benefit analysis comes in, sitting down and working out what the advantages and disadvantages are with continuing the behavior or with stopping the behavior, looking at legal consequences, and also helping people to try and come to terms with the fact that they have lost, that their behavior constitutes a failure, and they need to move on from this. There is then the stage of preparation. This is in actually deciding with somebody what steps they're going to take to try and stop the stalking behavior. And so it's developing a plan, selecting therapeutic targets, involving the stalker in selecting which of their problems they're going to work on, so they actually own the whole process, and continually stressing to them the potential benefits if they manage to change their behaviors. And this all has to be done in a way which preserves the dignity of the stalker. Then there is action. This is the implementation of the various therapeutic modules, positive reinforcement when things go well, trying to find alternatives that people could do to replace the maladaptive behavior. People who stalk can dedicate most of their waking life to it. It can fill their thoughts, occupy all their day. If they're going to stop doing this, they need something else to do at the time when they would previously have been stalking. And, of course, people have lapses, and it's necessary when these occur to look at the reasons behind them and to try and work out strategies for avoiding relapses in the future. And the final stage is maintenance. This means developing plans to deal with potentially perilous situations so that they can avoid situations in which they might relapse into stalking behavior, or work out in advance how to deal with particular difficulties that might lead them into stalking behavior. And then there's gentle encouragement. Now, I've outlined to you the way in which we assess the more difficult cases, and I've given you some idea of how we would set about treating stalkers. But what are the difficulties in implementing this? Well, there is a lack of understanding, and police, prosecutors, and magistrates in our country give stalking a relatively low priority. This is about to change. Our current Interior Minister, who is a woman, is deciding on a new stalking strategy, and we hope that she will incorporate into it some of the ideas that I've outlined to you. The second thing is that I've been talking about the detailed assessment of stalking cases, but there are very few people trained to do this work. So we are having training courses on a regular basis for people that work in prisons and for psychiatrists and psychologists. We have some solicitors who wish to do the training as well when they specialize in this sort of case. Thirdly, I've talked about treatment, but there are very few people who do this sort of treatment at the moment. Most treatment in our mental health services is targeted at psychotic illness, but I'm talking about treating difficult behaviors, and we need to have programs for this. The necessary measures in implementing anti-stalking strategies are a government commitment to stalking as a priority area, and we hope we are about to get that. Lots of training for police and prosecutors and magistrates. The introduction of standardized risk assessment of the sort that I've outlined. the training of professionals to provide such risk assessment, and treatment centres for stalkers, just as we have treatment centres for sex offenders. We have a website which relates to our service, which my colleague will give the next talk and tell you about.
Il professor David James per la sua importante relazione, perché è particolarmente importante per noi, perché una delle critiche maggiori che vengono rivolte fondatamente alla normativa che ha introdotto il reato di stalking è quella di non avere previsto dei trattamenti di tipo appunto psicologico sullo stalker, per cercare di fargli percepire la gravità del suo comportamento, per cercare di appunto farlo smettere, di fargli cambiare condotta, di fargli capire che non deve reiterare questa condotta, che una volta interrotta questa condotta poi non deve riniziarla con un'altra vittima, perché spesso abbiamo visto dalla cronaca che lo stalker non si ferma con la prima vittima, ma poi uccisa la prima, o se la prima riesce a liberarsi ne trova una seconda, ne trova una terza. Prima di passare la parola al professor Farnham, anche per problemi organizzativi della traduzione, direi che abbiamo 5 minuti per, se qualcuno ha delle domande da fare, insomma, per anticipare un attimo il dibattito. Io vorrei iniziare io ponendone una al professor David James proprio su questo aspetto. Vorrei maggiori chiarimenti. Non ha la traduzione. Dovrebbe mettere forse su. Vorrei maggiori chiarimenti sul momento in cui scatta, e se scatta automaticamente, il trattamento o la terapia psicologica di cui ci ha parlato negli Stati Uniti nei confronti dello stalker. Cioè scatta dopo che è stato denunciato, scatta dopo che è stato condannato, scatta?
Treatment for stalkers usually commences when the criminal justice process provides some way of forcibly giving some form of treatment. Occasionally, this is when somebody is on bail facing a charge of stalking. A condition of the bail would then be attendance at a treatment centre. But usually, the treatment would be undertaken as part of a community sentence, or for offenders that have been given prison sentences as a condition of their release from prison. So if they don't attend or don't participate in the stalking, they can be sent in the stalking treatment, they can be sent back to prison. So it's usually at those two stages that such treatment would be undertaken.
Grazie. Se qualcuno ha delle domande, gli diamo la parola. Sì.
Intanto approfittato che qualcuno di voi intanto che voi pensate a qualche domanda, se c'è, volevo fare un intervento rispetto a quello che è stato detto adesso. Se pensiamo a quanto ci è stato esposto da David James circa il trattamento e le possibilità di intraprendere un trattamento per stalker nel Regno Unito, mi viene in mente la nostra situazione, rispetto alla quale ovviamente molti aspetti sono ancora da indagare, e il riferimento è non solo all'assenza di qualsiasi possibilità di trattamento nella nostra norma, ma anche a quello che succede per esempio in ambito penitenziario, quando un soggetto è detenuto e autore di stalking, è uno stalker. Il problema che si pone talvolta è quello dell'accesso ai benefici penitenziari. La prima cosa che uno stalker potrà fare in permesso premi è quella di recarsi a trovare la sua vittima. Ecco, su questo tema ancora penso che anche gli operatori penitenziari dovranno avere così adeguate informazioni e conoscenze. Ci è già capitato di confrontarci su questi aspetti e se per noi forse qualche informazione sul fenomeno dello stalking è già abbastanza comune e condivisa, ci sono categorie di operatori che ancora non hanno avuto occasione di confrontarsi con questi problemi. Mi diceva qualcuno degli operatori penitenziari con i quali sono venuto in contatto che è un problema da loro abbastanza sentito e rispetto al quale a volte faticano ad orientarsi.
Vedo che la professoressa De Fazio mi guarda.
Sì, so che tu non puoi fare a meno di intervenire.
No, allora vabbè, io stavo qui bella tranquilla, mi prendevo un po' di relax, invece evidentemente sono stimolata, nel senso che noi a Milano abbiamo per esempio un progetto di trattamento in generale per i partner violenti, quindi non vuol dire solamente stalker, ma vuol dire quei casi che vi raccontavo prima vengono da una ricerca in questo senso. E il progetto riguarda, che forse non andrà avanti per mancanza di fondi, lo dico subito così tanto per rallegrarci un po' tutti. In pratica ci vengono mandati da Tribunale della Sorveglianza e dall'UEP, l'Ufficio dell'Esecuzione Penitenziaria Esterna, soggetti che sono in misura alternativa alla detenzione. Perché? Appunto perché il problema è che in carcere esiste virtualmente un trattamento, ma se c'è qualcuno di voi che sa come vanno le cose, sa anche che le risorse sono vergognosamente insufficienti. Non è che gli operatori non sono preparati da soli, si autopreparano. Semplicemente che se uno ha 60-70 detenuti e ha di fatto, io una volta mi ero presa anche la briga di fare un po' un conto, dividendo gli operatori penitenziari sul territorio nazionale per il numero dei detenuti e veniva qualcosa tipo mezz'ora al mese a testa. È chiaro poi che a seconda ci sono soggetti che magari non hanno neanche bisogno di trattamento, ci sono soggetti che avrebbero bisogno un po' più di mezz'ora al mese. Ora, la situazione quindi è che l'operatore fa fatica anche solo a scrivere 2 righe per quel che riguarda l'eventuale osservazione per il Tribunale della Sorveglianza. Tantomeno può trattare. Come dicevo, il training se lo deve fare da solo perché ben poco viene previsto e ben poco di specifico, perché il problema è anche evidentemente che la fisionomia del crimine cambia, i problemi culturali che stanno alla base del crimine cambiano e non sono solo il fatto che noi abbiamo adesso in carcere etnie diverse, sono anche proprio la cultura di noi italiani che si evolve o si involve a secondo anche da un punto di vista criminale. Questi soggetti, gli stalker, ma direi in generale i partner violenti, allora in pratica quello che gli succede è che vengono parcheggiati per un periodo più o meno lungo in carcere, più o meno lungo a seconda del comportamento, dove non solo non hanno la possibilità di incontrare una cultura di tipo diverso, qualcuno che gli dica guarda che veramente non è vero che le mogli vanno disciplinate, si può anche pensarla in un altro modo, no, nessuno può dire, hanno ben poche occasioni di sentire una voce diversa, anzi hanno semmai occasione di rinforzarsi nella loro sottocultura, perché intanto perché la sottocultura carceraria è una sottocultura prepotentemente di discriminazione di genere, perché poi siccome sono entrati con l'idea che era loro perfetto diritto disciplinare, questo di solito è fare ordine in famiglia, sono queste le espressioni che io mi sono sentita dire, allora sono anche più arrabbiati perché sono stati messi in galera, quindi escono raramente migliorati. Tutt'al più, vabbè, sono messi in condizioni di non nuocere per un periodo un po' lungo, ma non è questa la funzione principale della pena, o almeno io, purtroppo cosa volete, sono così vecchia che mi sono studiata la Costituzione e avevo letto un'altra cosa rispetto alle funzioni della pena. Avete visto quel signore di cui vi ho parlato prima? È rifidanzato, non è l'unico, e anche leggendo di altri autori che raccontano di questi uxoricidi, di questi violenti in famiglia, trovano che sono tutti subito già tutti, che sono molti che hanno ritrovato una partner. Quello che dico io è che evidentemente ci sono donne che hanno un'idea delle referenze un po' particolare, ma a parte questo, allora, perché questi soggetti appunto non cercare di offrire l'opportunità di incontrare un modo diverso di vedere le cose e anche di incontrare un aiuto, perché sia gli stalker sia gli uomini violenti non sono solo prepotentoni, sono anche prepotentoni, ma sono anche molto dipendenti, sono persone davvero disperate senza l'altro, quindi c'è veramente un'esigenza di trattamento oltre anche la punizione, ma anche oltre alla punizione. Ecco, quello.
Sì, e vorrei aggiungere una considerazione rispetto a quello che ha detto la professoressa Merzagora. I dati raccolti da tutti i centri di osservazione, dall'Istat, dalle ricerche che vi abbiamo esposto, ma anche i giornali ce lo dicono, la cronaca ce lo conferma, la maggior parte dei casi di stalking avviene al momento della rottura della coppia, quindi della separazione, dell'interruzione della convivenza, e vede autore degli atti persecutori il partner maschile, vittima la partner femminile, che nella maggior parte dei casi sono poi anche madre e padre. Ora, io trovo veramente inaccettabile che il legislatore e neppure la giurisprudenza si siano ancora resi conto che in questi casi non è applicabile l'istituto dell'affido condiviso. Non si può continuare ad affidare i bambini in modo condiviso al padre e alla madre e viceversa quando uno dei due genitori è uno stalker, perché allora questo vuol dire aiutare lo stalker a continuare nel suo progetto di persecuzione, utilizzando il figlio e i suoi diritti genitoriali di frequentazione del figlio come un mezzo di persecuzione per l'altro partner. Noi lo vediamo benissimo, il bambino viene richiesto o non viene riportato a casa o viene riportato a casa con vestiti sporchi, oppure viene con la scusa della malattia del bambino il padre o l'altro coniuge o l'altro partner vuole entrare a tutti i costi nella casa. Ci si ritrova con il genitore non collocatario che con la scusa del bambino segue, pedina la moglie, la fa pedinare perché non segue con la scusa del bambino, non accetta, vuole controllare che non ci sia un'altra persona nella vita familiare del figlio della prole, eccetera eccetera. Anche di questo aspetto si dovrà rendere conto, in primis credo i giudici di legittimità, ancora prima quelli di merito, e poi anche il legislatore, per prevedere normativamente che nell'ipotesi di sussistenza di un fenomeno di stalking, scusate, l'affido condiviso non può essere dichiarato, perché questo si risolverebbe, appunto, come ho già detto, in un incremento, rinforzo del fattore di rischio, oltretutto in forza di un provvedimento dell'autorità giudiziaria, il che sarebbe abnorme. Se non ci sono domande, ecco, prego. Abbiamo un microfono, se qualcuno ci aiuta. Sì?
Eccolo là, trovato.
Va bene.
Intanto le rispondo io in attesa di effettuare una traduzione. Allora, confermo che ovviamente il fenomeno dello stalking interessa in prevalenza dal punto di vista della diffusione, come autori gli uomini e come vittime le donne. E il fatto che noi spesso utilizziamo il termine al maschile nei nostri contributi si riferisce solamente al fatto che sono i casi prevalenti, ma questo non significa che non esistano casi di stalking che coinvolgono le donne come autrici e che questi non vadano tenuti in considerazione ai fini, per esempio, della valutazione del rischio. Nel caso concernente l'attività di ricerca che abbiamo effettuato a Modena, i casi che abbiamo analizzato erano 59, tra questi 5 concernevano stalker di sesso femminile, se non ricordo male, o comunque insomma erano pochi, e diciamo, la variabile sesso, appartenenza al sesso maschile o sesso femminile non aveva rilevanza, quindi quello che io ho detto questa mattina vale a prescindere dall'appartenenza al sesso maschile o femminile, sia se si tratta di un uomo che di una donna.
Posso dare un input sulle pari opportunità al signore che è intervenuto, dicendo che oggi pomeriggio, per esempio, parlando di stalking in ambito professionale, almeno in un ambito che è quello dello stalking che colpisce le professioni mediche, invece per quel poco che abbiamo trovato, perché è una ricerca all'inizio, ci sono più donne. Quindi se lei tiene duro anche oggi pomeriggio, le studiamo tutte per tenervi qui.